The land is sacred. These words are at the core of your being. The land is our mother. The rivers are blood. Take our land away and we die. That is, the Indian in us dies. Merry brave bird, Lakota. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Lao Tzu. And we are tipping point, radio tipping point, better said. Mike Boyle at the helm. And today we will be talking about a bunch of different things as usual, but primarily concentrating on those things that I would call the root cause. The root cause. And we're not going to talk about symptoms today. No siree. No symptoms allowed. And for that, we need to spend some time in the realm of physics so that we can get our economy straight. Capitalism's conundrum, nature's capital, human hustle, and the habits of sufficiency. And I'm going to start with some basic physical tenets that are not to be disputed. And the importance should be quite clear when we move on. But let's start with the first law of thermodynamics, which means that we do not lose energy, it just takes on different forms. And in fact, that is the beauty of our planet, that it was built in a regenerative fashion, meaning that we would use the energy and it would take on different forms and be recycled back into the system so that future generations could use that energy as well. And the key here is the word regeneration, because that means it's able to reproduce itself in comparison to those things that we as human beings create. But let me not get ahead of myself here. Let's move on to the second law of thermodynamics, which infers that energy, that it decreases through time. Its effectiveness decreases through time. It's a word that we use for it. It's called entropy. And when you think about it, it's quite normal, because if indeed energy stays with us, the real question is to what degree we can use it. And it will take on different forms and go back into the system so that future generations can use it. But that means that there has to be a decline in that energy. So keep those two concepts in mind as we move forward with this program today. If you think of both the first and the second law of thermodynamics, then you understand the idea of natural capital. Natural capital would be those things that nature gives to us. Be it the non-renewable energy like fossil fuels, or the renewable energies like solar or wind, or those renewable energies that we take for granted, and because we take it for granted and we consider all this to be for free, we show our ignorance as human beings. Let me give you one example, one being water. Water is a renewable energy. We use it as energy. And if you believe in the first law of thermodynamics, it stays with us in some fashion. And then we'll go through the cycle. But just because it's renewable energy doesn't mean that it's going to be renewable in our lifetimes. And this is really the problem, folks, that we've been dealing with so far. Because we have built this system where we take these resources, we consider them to be for free. We look at those resources as being a profit for us, although we know that they're not limitless, or perhaps we've thought that they are limitless, but they're not. And then we produce things, and at the end, they're disposed. So keep those two laws of thermodynamics in your head while we go through that scenario, extracting the resources, manufacturing something, consuming, and then burying it or whatever we do. So the energy is always with us, but the real question is to what degree we have created a system that allows for that energy to be recycled back into the system. And because we think that we're so clever as human beings and that we control nature, we concentrated on speed and so-called efficiency as being the basis of growth. But within that model, we forget these laws of thermodynamics. That the energy stays with us, but it might not necessarily be in a form that we can use, either through entropy, or because we have created something that cannot be properly digested by nature, that it takes hundreds of years for all of this energy to be properly brought back into the system. Nature will do it. But the real question is, to what degree do we get to a point where we've used all of the primary resources without thinking of how we allow for nature to bring that properly back into a system. And then we've built a model that is trying to use these resources as quickly as possible. That's our goal, to be as quick as possible. And at the end, we hand all of this back to nature with the energy pretty much zapped out of it, and expect for this to continue. So when people talk to me about global warming and all this stuff, yes, I agree, it's a problem, but This one that I'm talking about now is really the root cause. Can we please start with a root cause? Root cause, root cause. So I mentioned to you the concept of natural capital. So is that the only capital we have? No, of course not. That's the one that we think is for free and we can do with it whatever we like. But we've created this other capital. It's called human capital. And we confuse them quite often, but they have nothing to do with each other, or very little to do with each other. And the only thing that they have in common is that we need the natural capital for the human capital to work. There was a book I was reading a year or two ago. I forget exactly, and unfortunately I can't even quote the author. But the message that I received from that book has haunted me ever since those concepts were presented. It's so simple, so poignant, so prescient, that we're not able to see it because it's right in front of us. You know those things, if you were to hold your hand in front of your nose, that you really can't see your hand, it becomes blurry? Well, that's the problem that we have. A lot of these concepts that should be so self-evident, they're right in front of us and we just can't see them. Well, you know, nature is really the only one who's producing anything here. Nature produces the water, nature produces the earth, nature produces the primary resources we use for our food. I'm not talking about processed food here, folks. It doesn't grow in the supermarket. No, it doesn't. Nature was the one who provided us with these fossil fuels. Nature is the one that provides us with the sun. But we think that we're better than nature and that we are the ones that are actually the ones who are producing. And can I tell you something that should not be a secret? Because it's not a secret. Actually, we don't produce anything. Nature is the one who's been producing all the time. We manufacture, and in fact, it's to be found within the name, manufacture. Yes, manufacturing. And the reason why we think we produce is because once we run out of one of the natural resources, then we perform an activity which is called substitution. So one that we know quite well, where we moved from coal on to petroleum, and now we're looking to make the pivot onto solar, wind, and whatever. I think they were putting all of our money on hydrogen. But within that leapfrogging that we do, that energy leapfrogging, we're not producing anything. We're just taking what nature's giving us and we are substituting one for another. So I'd like you all to think about that the next time we talk about what we are producing as human beings. We're not producing anything. We're just taking what nature gives us and we are doing something with it. But that's really where the problem starts. Going back to what I talked about earlier. So we take these resources from nature, we do something with it. We consider that to be progress. This is the source of our profits. But after the entropy is hit in, following that second law of thermodynamics, we have created something that nature cannot digest. Well, it digests it, all right, but not in the same speed that we're producing it, which means if you think about a conveyor belt, and things are coming down the conveyor belt, and you're supposed to pick up things from the conveyor belt and take them off. So there's some basic tenets that are essential for this process to be smooth, is that we are having those things coming down the conveyor belt at a speed that we can actually react to it. And it's all tied to our reaction time, and perhaps a place to put all these things. That might be another one that we need to take into consideration. But the problem we have within this model is that we need to have things go faster and faster and faster down this conveyor belt. So we've come up with this glorious idea. Well, we can't do this as human beings, so we will use technology to perform the actions. All well and good, but there are some problems tied to this scenario. The first one is, so once the technology is taking these things off the conveyor belt, and the technology can work much quicker than we can, it still needs to put it somewhere, because whether it's the human being or the technology, we cannot ignore the laws of thermodynamics, and we keep pretending we can, but we can't ignore them. So the technology will be able to manage all of this quicker. But what do we do with it? And we have this fallacy. In fact, I didn't even think about it, but it's true. But we look at technology as if it's nature. We think that technology is free, and like technology grows on trees, and all we need to go is to the tree of technology and take some fruit from the tree of technology, and we've created our Garden of Eden. But little do we realize that tree of technology can only be built on those things that nature has given us. And here I'm thinking primarily of the energy that's required to create that tree of technology. Because that tree of technology does not grow by itself. And we as human beings think that we are so damn clever to come up with this idea of the tree of technology that we forget that this tree can only grow if we have the energy that the tree needs. And then we come up with this idea, but we'll build these data centers in areas where there's plenty of solar energy, or we have thermal energy, or hydroelectric energy is primarily the type of energy that's used for data centers. But we tend to forget that it's nature that has given us the hydroelectric capability, because it's that natural resource called water. And what we tend to forget is that there's a strong possibility, because of what we've been doing all of these years, and we've seen it here in Austria. We've seen it, and in fact, I don't think we talk about these things enough, that due to the drought, especially 2 years ago, we were so proud of using hydroelectric energy, but there's a basic premise tied to the use of this energy, and that is that we actually have the water to create the hydroelectric energy. And again, we keep forgetting our dependence on something much greater than us, and that being that of what nature provides. So I mentioned this idea that we think that we're so clever because we can substitute one type of resource from nature with another. And then really, what are we doing? We're moving away from fossil fuels, or we're trying to move away from fossil fuels. But the mining doesn't stop, because now the hot items are the minerals that are required for batteries, because we need to figure out ways to store this energy that we're getting from nature for free. And so the activities don't stop. The engine doesn't stop. The growth mania doesn't stop. So that means we really do need to perform a massive reset. And so if we talk about all these things, and we're looking at natural capital, and we understand the human capital is very much tied to this labor being replaced by technology, and this is the big subject but it's all tied to this obtuse creation that we have put together called money. And the actual value of money. The economist Frederick Soddy stated close to 100 years ago now that the reason why we needed money to begin with was all tied to the second law of thermodynamics and this entropy, because we needed to come up with a way to overcome that natural entropy that takes place with those goods to be found within nature, because they do go through a life cycle, and we're trying to prolong the value of those things that we create as long as possible. And of course, we know the results once we're done with them. And so we've created them for long lives, and so the refuge is also based on long life, and it cannot be digested. But when you think about it, this idea of money has had an interesting trajectory throughout the years, because we more or less based it on coinage, more specifically gold and then silver, and we would go back and forth. And one of the reasons why we love gold so much, apart from that it shines, is that it's one of those few items that once you create something out of gold, you can pretty much recover everything that was to be found within that original primary resource. Don't even talk about the poison that was used to actually allow for the gold to stay in that state. That's another story. And so the big battle, and we still have it today, where countries are stockpiling on gold because they're all waiting for D-Day. But we continued for all these years based on some sort of gold standard. And then we had Bretton Woods in 44-45, where the gold standard was based upon amounts of money and the value of the dollar until 1971, where that system fell apart. And since then, it's been Casino Royale, meaning that the value of our money is based upon all kinds of intangible factors based on future speculation, based on what we think it will be worth later on. But this is just one big betting parlor, because we know that even money, if left alone, goes through the second law of thermodynamics. But we come up with all kinds of ways to hoodwink ourselves to think that this is all managed. And that means that we are so far off kilter from true value, and the true value would be tied to natural capital, those things that nature gives us. We're so far removed that our real problem is the lack of reality of the system that we've created. And when we're really talking about problems, folks, this is the real problem. The global warming and the like is only the effect of all these other things that we've been doing. So if we want to really solve the problem, then we better start looking at how do we bring monetary value, put it in line with natural capital, which would mean that we would have to come up with a system which allows for those things that we use for exchange, that they will work in harmony with natural capital. So when you think about that, what does that actually mean? That means that the value of our money has to be tied to how well it could work with natural capital. Well, then our values have to be changing big time. And that means we have to first start in thinking of all of this, what we're doing, in a much different way. And let's start with this idea of depletion of finite resources, and whatever they may be. Because in their current form, they are finite. Meaning that they will lose their value, and we need to deal with facts that nature takes time. It needs time. It needs time to create that steady state, which is really the basis of what we should be calling sustainability. So the first problem we need to address is we need to start looking at this primary resource extraction as being an accounts payable and not accounts receivable. Let me try to explain that in a different format. So accounts payable is the money that you owe. And accounts receivable is the money that you get. And so the problem that we have is that we keep extracting these primary resources, knowing that they're finite. And for those that are performing the extraction, it's a big win. So I ask you a question. If you were to perform a withdrawal from your bank account, would you consider that to be a win? Basically, you're performing the withdrawal because you need to pay for something. So the money takes on the form of covering our debts. So if we look at it from that perspective, then we should never ever be able to look at the depletion of finite resources as being a win. We are taking them, and that means when they're no longer there, they're not there. And that they will come back in some form over hundreds of years or maybe even centuries. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm going to be around that long to see, once those finite resources have been depleted, that I'll have a chance to see them when they're back in their new renewed fashion. So that's the first problem that we need to address, is that we keep thinking of the depletion of finite resources as being a profit. Because as long as we think of it as being a profit, we're never going to square this circle. No. Let's move on to the next one. Going back to what Walter Rostow, when President Kennedy asked him, "How can you guarantee 5% growth for me?" He came up with the analogy of the airplane that keeps going higher and higher and higher. But when they asked Rostow, well, what happens following the adage, another law of physics, what goes up must come down. So how's this plane supposed to land? And he was not able to answer the question. But as long as this model that consumption is growth, and that our growth is all tied to having things coming down that virtual conveyor belt quicker and quicker, meaning that we need more and more of those primary resources, knowing full well that at the end of this conveyor belt, once we're finished with these goods, and once for us the entropy is hit us straight, and actually we're even worse than that when I think about it. We have all kinds of use for all of these goods, but for us personally, in particular, we see no more value, so we keep throwing away this energy. And then we think we're doing such a great job because we burn the stuff and we use the energy from the actual combustion. But unless we're able to turn this model on its head, meaning that the value should be in the longevity of those things that we manufacture. And the longevity can take on different forms, and certainly to get away from just throwing things away is a nice first step. It doesn't come close to actually solving the problem. But the real issue is, instead of rewarding companies and ourselves inevitably for squandering all of these primary resources, we need to address this problem in the model and ensure that the value is to be found within longevity, and that is required. And then the last part is tied to this waste. So let's assume that we are able to manage the second part properly, that being that we're able to ensure that of what we create as human beings, what we manufacture, that the value is tied to longevity and utilizing the energy that was used and utilizing the energy to be found within the components. Then the third part of this equation means that we need to come up with a much better way for whatever's left, which is still energy. Again, following the first law of thermodynamics, then we need to figure out how can this be as efficiently digested by nature so that we can get it back into the system so that it just kind of runs on its own. This show has been one that I've been preparing for a long, long time. And in undertaking such an endeavor, I understand all too well that I'm taking on a mega subject. This one's a mega. But in preparing, I went ahead and researched to see, so this way that we do things, obviously we all know that it wasn't always done this way. This was more of we went into overdrive with the Industrial Revolution, and we have no brakes, so we cannot stop. And we have no brakes, and so we cannot stop. But it wasn't always that way. And I found all kinds of beautiful passages from different religions and different cultures tied to these concepts that I believe that I've been talking about so far in the show, all tied to this question of natural capital. And that people believed for the longest time that we have been given all that we need to survive. And I'm not going to say that human beings haven't been ingenious. Of course, we've been very ingenious. And that is not to discount those things that we were able to put together. But within this concept of a steady state, that means that there is such a thing of what we would call too much of a good thing. There is such a thing. And that exists on various levels. And I won't go in too much into the human part, because I could do a show on that one alone. I like to stay within the realm of that of what has been big enough for 57 minutes, that's for sure. And the problem that we have is that on the back end, we have created so many things, we have manufactured so many things that cannot be digested by nature. And within this model, it's all tied to things coming out quicker and quicker and quicker. And our economic growth is all tied to this. So the model is skewed that we'll never be able, doesn't matter what kind of legislation we put through. It doesn't matter what kind of individual actions we perform. It doesn't matter what kind of collective initiatives we undertake. If the system is broken, then we're just putting band-aids on the existing system. And that was quite clear to me after nature spoke to us in a very distinct way. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to raise the question of the pandemic again. But nature was talking to us. And I was hoping that this would have been the wake-up call. But no. We kept singing the GDP song. Which meant for me that we were negating those things that were taking place in front of us as a wake-up call. And that obviously things have not gotten bad enough so that we can properly be addressing all of this. So let's stay with these three components, because that's more than enough of a focus for this show. So how do you think we can come up with new ways to ensure that extraction of finite resources is considered to be a debit? That the value of what we create is tied to longevity and not how quickly it passes through the conveyor belts. And then lastly, of those things that where we as human beings cannot extract any more energy in a proper fashion. And sorry, burning plastics is not the right way to manage petroleum, which are fossil fuels, in spite of anything that certain waste management companies might be telling you, private or public. There's one additional component I want to throw into the mix for today. And this would all be tied to what is the actual value of money. And I mentioned earlier the path where we based it on coinage, and then we started with printed money, and that was all supposed to be backed by gold or silver. And we've gotten away from all of that, and now it's based upon whatever we're able to convince the others of. Partially tied to elements that's coming from nature, like the fossil fuels, or the potential that technology will be coming up with, again, based on things from nature. So when you think about these situations, or these confrontations that we have, and how do we value money, it's all pretty much tied to nature. But when you think about it, money, being that arbitrary, doesn't really fit into those things that we measure, right? It's denoted as a number. But the real issue, and this is something that's very much tied to nature as well, it's tied to credits and debits. So when you think about it, what money is good for, it's used to pay our debts. So when you take money out of a bank account, you're paying your debt. And you try to figure out ways that you have some reserves so that you don't spend all your time in Debtville. So when you start thinking of everything tied to credits and debts, well, there's a there's an analogy that we can bring into this description, into this narrative, that's very much tied to nature. And in fact, this is probably the fourth component that is so basic. Again, it's like holding your hand in front of your face and you cannot see it because it's so obvious. You know, when we allow for nature to flourish, we keep raising the question, so where's the business case? Where's the profit margin? How can we afford to do this? But when you think about that type of regeneration that we know so well as human beings, do we raise those same questions? I'm gonna play with this analogy, and hopefully not too many people will be offended. So let's put a business case on a child. Actually, we do that in society because we've created a society where you have to be financially independent to keep the population machine going, and that's one of our problems because we don't have a business case. We're not getting any incentives to procreate. And I'm not talking about the choice here, folks. I'm talking about whether we can actually afford it or not. But when you think of it, when we bring children into the world, it's not tied to that of what they can bring right away, but it's all tied to this idea of regeneration, which is actually what nature's all about, right? So when we create environment so that nature can flourish, and that we use those primary resources in a fashion so that nature can better digest that of what we're creating. Then within this new model, which is actually the oldest model that you could ever imagine, then we need to figure out a way to tie money, the value of money, and this concept of growth, that we need to figure out ways to tie these concepts to these basic tenets that we cannot negate. They are there. Whether you like it or not, they are there. And when you think of us, and you think of nature as being part of that cycle, and that energy, our energy, nature's energy, we are part of nature, that our energy stays forever, and that it takes on different forms, right? It takes on different forms. And then within that purpose that we all have, that being all living entities within this planet, and if we understand that our real goal should be tied to this concept of regeneration, and that all that we do needs to be firmly anchored into how do we make this process. And here, I would say our goal is to make that regeneration process as efficient as possible. And that would probably be one of the most constructive ways of using that left hemisphere of our brain. and ensuring that everything we do is based upon coming up with a more efficient regeneration model. So let me give you some takeaways as we're getting closer to the end. Some things I'd like you to think about. And you can think about it on a very small level, or you can take it from on a big level. It's up to you. Makes no difference. I'd like you to think about these 4 concepts that I've used as the basis of the show today. That being looking at the extraction of finite resources as not being a credit, but it's a debit that we have towards nature. It's a debit. And if we want to use our money properly, let's figure out a way to cover our debts there. And we should do it up front. We need to do all of this up front, because no end of pipe here. When we look at the problem after it's already commenced, and then we start doing something about it, which is pretty much the talk of all the CO2 and the like. We're way too late, folks. If we don't solve the challenges up front, then we should not be surprised that we never get it done properly. The second part I'd like you to concentrate on is this idea that the value of what we create as human beings, which I'm going to call strictly manufacturing, that we figure out ways for the value to be found in the longevity of what we create. That we look at this idea of credits and debts as the basic tenet of what we are using for our economic system in any way, shape, or form you want to go ahead and slice and dice it. That it needs to be tied to natural capital, meaning not only the extraction of the finite resources as being a debt, but let's figure out ways, once we have no proper uses of this energy that we have left tied to those things that we create as human beings, that we make it our goal to allow for those things to be as easily digestible by nature as possible. And with that, we can look at those things that we no longer need in their present form as being nutrition, so that we can pay off those debts that we had from the beginning. So then the last point I'd like to raise to close this circle, whether it be a tree or a human being, that when we are born, if we look at the investment that's made in us, and as we grow up, that it's our responsibility that the credit that we create is used to pay off, as a future investment for those that will come after us. And with that, we're truly getting much closer to creating that regenerative system that just works. It just works. We don't have to think about it, because it just works. And last words for me for today is that when you think about it, this will be the last takeaway, when you think about it, all of these things are like that image that I talked about, and holding your hand to your eyes, and because we can't see them, because it's so apparent, it's so real, And so let's figure out ways to correct our eyesight and see those things right in front of us. See those things that nature has already spelled out. And that we create that world that works not just for us, but it will work for all of those entities that come after us, that take the energy that we leave behind. They take that energy and they use it for themselves so that they can thrive. Wouldn't that be something that we can leave as our own legacy, that we allowed for our energy to be that of what was used for the next generation to thrive? And with that, I hope that you all have a chance, individually and collectively, to thrive this week. I thank you very much for your time. And I will be back. Not an empty promise. I will be back with a new rendition of Tipping Point. And I thank you for your time.